Welcome to the Faith Talks Pod. This is day 25. As we end in the book of Genesis on this episode, Joseph is seen falling at his father's face and weeping. This is not political Joseph. This is not Governor Joseph. This is a son bearing his father. Egypt may know Jacob as a dignitary, but Joseph knows him as Israel, the man who wrestled God and walked with a limp and a promise. And what follows is one of the most striking cultural crossings in all of the book of Genesis. Jacob is embalmed. This was not an Israelite custom. In fact, this is the only place in Scripture where an Israelite undergoes Egyptian embalming. The process was elaborate and ritual heavy, performed by trained mortuary priests. The internal organs were removed. The body was placed in embalming fluids for 40 days. In Egyptian belief, the body had to be preserved as a vessel for the soul in the afterlife. But make no mistake, Jacob is not being Egyptianized. This embalming serves only two purposes. It honors Egyptian expectations, yes, but more importantly, it preserves Jacob's body for burial in Canaan. Because Jacob will not stay where he prospered, he will rest where God promised. Then comes the mourning. 70 days of mourning. That number actually matters. This likely includes the 40 days of embalming plus the traditional 30-day mourning period we see later with Moses. But here's what should stop us as the reader. The Egyptians mourn as well. This is not a private family grief, but Jacob is honored like royalty, a foreign patriarch given the respect of a visiting king. The entire empire pauses because a covenant man has died. Joseph then asks permission, not assumes it, in order to take his father home. Even with all his power, he respects order. Pharaoh grants it, and what follows is a procession unlike anything the patriarchs ever imagined. Officials, elders, chariots, horsemen, Egypt escorts Israel home. No one knows exactly where it was, and the route itself seems strange, but they stop east of the Jordan at the threshing floor of Atad. Why not just go straight to Hebron? But threshing floors were not random places. They were centers of commerce, law, decision-making, and community life. Ruth is redeemed on one. David builds an altar on one. They are places where life is weighed, separated, and made useful. And there for 7 days they mourn. Canaanites actually see this mourning and they are stunned. They renamed the place Abel Mizraim, the mourning of Egypt. There's wordplay there. Abel can mean stream, but it echoes Ebel, the Hebrew word for mourning. The land itself almost remembers the grief. Jacob leaves a mark even in death. Then they bury him where he asked to be buried. Not in pyramids, not in palaces, but in the cave. The same cave with Abraham, with Isaac, and with promise, because faith does not ask where you thrived. It asks where God spoke. And then the story shifts. Jacob is gone and the brothers begin to panic. They're wondering now that their dad is dead if Joseph is going to seek revenge. So they send a message, this sort of half apology, half fear. Joseph then, hearing that apology, begins to weep, but this time for a very different reason. It's not grief, but it's almost misunderstanding. He says, "You meant it for evil, brothers, but God meant it for good." That sentence is not denial, but it is theology forged in suffering. Joseph does not rewrite the pain, he reinterprets it through providence. And Joseph lives on. He lives long enough to see grandchildren, long enough to become fully Egyptian in age, dying at 110 years old, the ideal lifespan in Egyptian culture. Most Egyptians died between 40 and 50, and Joseph outlives the average man by decades. He is embalmed as well, placed in a coffin, but he is not buried. Genesis does not end with land possessed, it ends with bones waiting, because the promise is still on the move. Joseph dies in faith, believing that one day God will bring his people up out of Egypt, and when he does, he's asking to not let his bones be left there. Genesis closes not with fulfillment, but with expectation. A coffin in Egypt, a promise in heaven, and a God who keeps moving his people forward even through death. Ending in Matthew chapter 17, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain, away from the noise, away from the crowds, away from the expectations, and Matthew is very intentional with that timing. He says, after 6 days. To a biblically literate Jewish reader, that phrase immediately rings a bell. 6 days recalls Exodus chapter 24, when Moses waited as the cloud of God's glory settled on Mount Sinai before the Lord spoke. In other words, something Sinai-shaped is about to happen, and it does. Jesus is transfigured before them. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become dazzling white. Ancient readers knew stories of transformation. Greek myths spoke of gods revealing hidden glory, and Jewish apocalyptic writings described angels and resurrected saints shining with heavenly radiance. But Matthew is not borrowing mythology. He is invoking a memory. This is Moses coming down the mountain again. Exodus tells us that Moses' face radiated glory after speaking with God, so much so that Israel could barely even look at him. But here's the difference. Moses reflected glory. Jesus emits glory. The light does not bounce off of him, but it comes from him. Then Moses and Elijah actually appear. To Jewish ears, this is thunderous. Elijah never died. He was taken by God. Moses died, but God himself buried him. Jewish tradition expected both men to return at the end of the age. Both had encountered God on this same mountain, Sinai. The law and the prophets are standing beside Jesus, not as equals, but as witnesses. Peter's overwhelmed, but he is sincere. And in classic fashion, Peter blurts out a plan. 3 shelters, 3 tabernacles. This makes sense to him. Israel once lived in tabernacles while God's glory dwelled among them in the wilderness. Peter is just trying to preserve the moment, to institutionalize the glory, to keep heaven on the mountain. But God actually interrupts Peter. A cloud overshadows them. The same glory cloud that covered Sinai, the same presence that filled the tabernacle in Exodus chapter 40. Matthew even uses the same Greek word found in the Septuagint. This is not fog, but this is Shekinah glory. And then the voice speaks. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. That final phrase matters. It echoes the book of Deuteronomy chapter 18, where the promise that God would raise up a prophet like Moses and command Israel to heed him. God is saying this is the one Moses pointed to. This is the voice above all other voices. The disciples fall on their faces because this is what humans do when they encounter unfiltered holiness. Ezekiel did it. Daniel did it. Heaven, in fact, has a weight, and it presses people down. Then Jesus touches them. He says, "Get up. Don't be afraid." And when they look again, Moses is gone, Elijah is gone, and only Jesus remains. The law and the prophets take a step back because fulfillment has arrived. As they walk down the mountain, Jesus commands silence. And then the disciples ask the question every Jewish child knew to ask: if Elijah must come first, then what just happened? And Jesus answers in a way that reshapes expectation. He says that Elijah has come, not in fire from heaven, but in John the Baptist. Not restoring politics, but calling hearts back to God. Malachi promised Elijah would restore families, reconcile hearts, make people ready. Jesus says that promise was fulfilled, but not the way most expected. And just as John suffered, so will the Son of Man. The mountain of glory points toward the hill of the cross. The transfiguration is not escapism, it is confirmation. It tells us that the suffering Jesus had been predicting is not weakness, but it is obedience. The shining Christ is the crucified Christ, and the voice that thundered on the mountain will be silent on Good Friday. But glory will shine again, and this time it will not fade. Thank you for tuning into the Faith Talks pod today. Make sure you stay to the end of this video to see all the associated handles with this podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe, and all the things. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow on day 26. God bless.